interesting how these passages speak to us in this day and age. This is definitely a very political message, and I think that it speaks to us in several ways about how church and state historically have played a role with one another. As we struggle with how to organize ourselves here in America, with the flooding that hit us yet again this last week, with the assassination attempt against a former president, I think that we are all very aware that there is a threat to the stability of our democracy. Within this country, we have tried to build up a healthy separation of powers, in particular the separation of power between the church and the state. As people of faith, I think that we are generally aware that faith has always in some way been political. It is important for faith leaders to be able to speak to government. And one of the benefits of a structure like we have here through the First Amendment, the separation of powers, the idea behind that is that the state will not get in the way of whose voice is heard. And in like manner, that religion should not get in the way of whose voice is represented in government. I think that we are seeing that start to shift as religious powers and religious voices become more powerful and more prevalent in our day and age. And what we see here in this passage from Mark is the way in which voices compete to be represented by power. Herodias, in this story, her and her daughter, but primarily the mother, had a political agenda. She had been married to Philip, who was Herod's older brother. He was in line for the throne of Galilee, but because their father, Herod the Great, was kind of paranoid, he killed off most of his kids. And Philip went into exile, leaving his wife Herodias behind. Herodias had to look out for herself. I kind of understand where she's coming from in wanting John dead, because in order to preserve her way of life, her security, she formed a political marriage with her husband's younger brother. John didn't like this. He saw it as amoral. You shouldn't be marrying somebody who's already married to your brother who's still alive. I don't think that in this day and age we would have a problem with divorce and remarriage. That probably would not be the thing that bothered us. The thing that probably would have bothered us is the fact that all these people have the same name, because they're all related. But she had her life on the line with this marriage. And this person who was locked up in the dungeon of the place where she lived was also slowly making this argument to her husband that you shouldn't be married to her. This is amoral. He was making a sound moral argument based off of the moral understandings of that time. And Herod was slowly listening to that argument. I would make the case that speaking to power in that way is healthy. John did not have any power over Herod. He didn't have the ability to just tell Herodias to be quiet and not listen to her. But he did have the ability to speak to power. Herodias, on the other hand, had a card to play that John did not. She was able to move the forces of power in a way that silenced the opposition, the other point of view to her marriage. And she used that to kill off her political opponents. Back then, that was normal. But I think that if we look at the history of how powers and faith speak and work together, we can see that that is not the type of dynamic we want to have in our country. Jesus was getting compared, as he became more prominent, to figures like John the Baptist, to figures like Amos, to people like Elijah. People could tell that he was making a sound moral argument about how we should be following God in his time period. Not to get hung up so much on the laws that you abandon compassion, but to allow love to be your primary lens of interpreting God's laws in the world. Jesus was not the biggest, he wasn't really speaking against people like Herod, even though Herod was freaked out by the idea that this protege, this person who probably was a follower of John the Baptist, was getting a lot of headlines. The people that Jesus was speaking out against were the people at the temple. Literally, a combination of religious power and political power. And he was saying that they had allowed corrupt interests to get in the way of their job of being a representative of God's love in the world. We know how this story plays out. Once again, corrupt political power merged with religion is used to kill off an opponent. We do not want to fall into this type of scenario where one voice within our society is lifted up above those of many others. The reason why we have a separation of powers, the reason why we have a separation of church and state in this country is so that many different moral opinions can be put forward on the table. And I think what we're seeing right now, and I need to speak about this, with things like Project 2025, which is being promoted by the Heritage Foundation, you have a very structured plan that's in place that, should things go their way in November, is designed to make it so a certain type of Christianity will be elevated above all other moral voices within this country. It will be integrated into our government in a way that we have not seen in America before. Well, okay, let's be honest, we have seen it in America before. Because this state in particular used to be a theocracy. It was settled by Puritan, Calvinist Congregationalists who eventually became a part of the United Church of Christ. And there was a time in this state where if you ticked off your minister, you'd be in the stocks. If you didn't show up to service, you'd be in the stocks. If you didn't adhere to the political and moral opinion of one person in your community who happened to be wearing a stole and a collar, you could be in trouble. And that is the type of dynamic that we see bubbling up in our society today. I am very concerned with what happened yesterday, because when we see people trying to kill off their political opponents, and honestly, this probably was not a political group, this probably was an individual's, this probably was an attempt made by an individual, not by a group. But when we see political voices being silenced through violence, we find ourselves troublingly living into the type of violence that killed John the Baptist, the type of violence that killed Jesus. And the Bible serves, and the gospel serves as a warning about how that has an impact on everyday people's lives and how that keeps us from being able to hear the voice of God. It is very important that we be able to listen to each other when we explore morality within the world. If we as an institution want to be able to do our jobs, we need to be able to hear the opinions of people that we don't agree with. And very often we are inclined not to. We're inclined to hate those who disagree with us. We're inclined to want to separate ourselves from those who disagree with us. But if we're not able to hear opinions that we do not agree with, how then can we be certain that we are fully listening to the will of God? If we don't have the ability to determine what is, what speaks truth and what doesn't, if we're so locked in on one point of view. There is a lot for us to consider about the role of the church and how we speak to power going forward. And I think that that's something that this congregation needs to think about as well. How are we going to use our voice to speak God's love going forward, especially in the light of the rising political violence that we see in our country? January 6th, the attempt on Nancy Pelosi's husband's life, the shooting at the Republican ball game where Steve Scalise was injured, the rising violence that we see happening in our schools, the rising violence that we see happening around the world. This is not happening in a bubble. And it's important for us to be able to see the larger picture, the larger narrative that is at play when we take in these individual acts of violence that are happening in the world. I think that the story that we have from the gospel is important. It's important to understand the wider story. I can understand why Herodias was afraid of John. That doesn't excuse her actions. And I can understand that John, didn't agree with Herodias' marriage. Doesn't change the fact that nowadays we probably would not have a problem with it. It was consensual. She didn't have anything to do with her former husband at that point in time. Knowing the larger narrative is important. But we are entering into a political landscape where that larger narrative is being narrowed for us, where other points of view are being silenced. And if we allow for things like Project 2025 to become a reality in our country, voices like ours are likely going to get snuffed out. Heavy, but amen.